Hello everyone, welcome to the Solution to the Sleeping Beauty Problem and Other Anthropic Paradoxes, Part 3. Hopefully I haven't bored you too much with Part 2. In this video, we are finally going to get into the main content of the video series. In particular, I'm going to discuss the logical foundation of my solution to the Sleeping Beauty problem. And the foundation is simply this. Self-identification is based on the primitive perspective. Now, when you read this sentence, you might feel like not quite clear what exactly it's talking about. Let me assure you, this is a very simple and intuitive thing. The only reason it feels convoluted is because it's hard to describe something so basic with words. The key word in that sentence is, of course, primitive. So what does it mean? Something is primitive if it cannot be defined by previously defined terms or concepts. So it is not something that can be further reduced by more basic ideas. They are usually motivated with informal means, based on appeal to intuitions or experience. Let's look at some examples of primitive concepts. For example, in Euclidean geometry, the idea of a point is primitive. There is no definition or reduction of what a point is. You need to understand it based on intuition or experience. Similarly, there's the concept of contain or lies on. When we say a point lies on a line, or a line lies on a plane, there's no definition of what that means. It's something so basic we're supposed to understand intuitively. Similarly, in piano arithmetics, the concept of zero is primitive, so is the concept of a successor. And I suggest the concept of perspective is a primitive notion. And because I think perspective is a primitive concept, I cannot define it. I can only try to explain it with an appeal to intuition. I think most of us will agree that it is sensible to say everyone has a perspective. And to explain it in more detail, I would say we all experience the world. However, not everything in the world is experienced indifferently. Some part of it simply has a more direct connection and greater impact on the subjective experience. For example, assuming you are a human being living on Earth, then the gravity of Earth would have a more immediate and significant impact on the subjective experience than that of the Andromeda galaxy, even though, objectively speaking, the latter is much more substantial. So perspective really just reflects this undeniable feeling or sense of closeness or immediacy to the subjective experience. And self-identification is based on that. At the very center of the perspective, there's something most immediately relevant to the experience. Let's call it I. One example I like to use is this. There are a lot of people who has bumped their toes, but only when this person does it, the pain is directly felt. And that person will be the self. And the self-identification is not restricted to the physical agent. The perspective center can also identify a moment, which we call now, or a location, which we call here, based on their immediate connection to the subjective experience. And with that, I hope it is clear what it means to say self-identification is based on the primitive perspective. And this is the only thing I need for the solution. No additional assumptions required. And that logical foundation has some implications. First of all, it means self-identification is apparent. Because self-identification is based on something primitive, it is inherently clear. One example is to imagine there are two identical twin sisters. They look the same, their mannerisms are the same, and they wear the same clothes. So understandably, people have a hard time to tell them apart. Yet, from the perspective of one of the twins, there is no difficulty to tell which person is I. In fact, she doesn't need to know what are the different features between the two sisters. She can inherently tell which person is I, because she's experienced the world from its perspective. The second implication is that the self is in a logically unique position. From the twins example, we can see self-identification is not a process of picking out a particular agent from a group of observers with similar features. It stands out naturally. One example is the concept of self-interest. The reason I pay particular attention to the well-being of this physical person is not because it has some unique features, like a particular name or a specific look. It's because I'm experiencing the world from its perspective. It directly impacts the subjective experience and feelings. And the third implication is because the self is identified by something primitive, it is unexplainable and not analyzable. For example, you can raise the question, why am I this particular person instead of someone else? Why am I not Elon Musk, for example? There is simply no rational answer to that question. Who or what I am is one of those fundamental things about life that there is no way to reason, but simply accept as basic facts. Similarly, for questions like, could I have been born as someone else? What is the chance that I am born as who I am now? Again, there is no rational answer. Anyone who claims to have an explanation must have brought in some additional assumption into it. For example, the reincarnation of souls, like in Buddhism, or some sort of soul embodiment. Clearly, that's not something we're interested in discussing, as those answers are not based on rational reasoning. And here is the fourth and final implication, that self-identification is not communicable, it is perspective bound. This is something closely related to the fact that they are unexplainable. One example of this is to imagine someone's knocking on your door and you asked, who is it? And they answered, it's me. Surely this has happened to some of us, and it's pretty frustrating. Because if you do not recognize the voice, then that answer, it's me, gives you zero information. It doesn't help you in any way to figure out who's visiting. Yet to the visitor, that is a truthful and clear statement. I am the person who's knocking on the door. Only problem is this identification of I is only useful from your own perspective. It cannot be used by someone reasoning from another perspective. Therefore, it is incommunicable. At this point, some of you might be asking, well, you have spent a lot of time discussing trivial stuff, but how does all this connect to the paradoxes? We can take a look at the Sleeping Beauty problem. In particular, question 2 and 3. What is the probability that right now is the first awakening? And what happens to the probability of heads after learning the current awakening is the first? In some formulations, they may change to the probability of today being Monday. Note there are two potential awakenings, and the question is referring to a particular one. But the question doesn't use features to specify which particular one it is asking about. Instead, it uses words such as right now, currently, or today, which requires self-identification. In fact, we only treat the questions as properly formulated because we are able to imagine reasoning from beauty's perspective. So the meaning of words such as now is inherently clear. We can also have a look at the doomsday argument. Which human being's birth rank is used as evidence for doom soon? Well, my birth rank, or the current generation's birth rank. And now take a look at the presumptuous philosopher. Which potentially existing observer's actual existence is used as evidence of a bigger universe? Again, my existence. All these arguments and paradoxes require the use of self-identification from a particular perspective. In fact, Arnold Zuboff, who first formulated the Sleeping Beauty problem in the 80s, did not consider it an anthropic problem, which explains why it didn't get much attention initially. He used the Sleeping Beauty problem as a thought experiment to argue for open individualism, or in his words, universalism. It says there is only one self in the entire universe that contains everything conscious in it. That includes you and me. So I am part of you, and you are part of me. We are the same self. This is obviously a conclusion most people will have a hard time accepting, including myself. Fundamentally, it doesn't feel like you are part of me, and I suspect you feel the same way that I am not part of you. We can primitively tell us apart based on this different level of immediacy to the subjective experience. Interestingly, Arnold Zuboff did pay attention to the subjective immediacy. However, he thinks the self-identity must be based on something objective. Yes, no objective feature can tell you if something is yourself or not, so nothing will justify the differentiation. Therefore, everything conscious in the universe must be part of the only one self. That's how he reached this highly counterintuitive conclusion. And here we get to the reason why anthropic problems are so controversial in the first place. Remember in part 1 of this video series, I said the true solution to a paradox must explain why so many people, smart and highly educated, yet they tend to make mistakes when it comes to these problems. It is because we don't like to reason from a particular perspective. It is subjective and biased. We want our logic to be impartial and, above all, objective. And the general trend is that the more highly educated and better trained you are, the more likely you would want to argue objectively. So we avoid conducting the argument from the first-person perspective of a particular observer in a specific moment. Instead, we argue from the perspective of an imaginary impartial observer. There are many names to this. Sometimes we say from a God's eye view, or argue from the perspective of the view from nowhere, as Thomas Nagel suggested, or we just refer to it as a third-person perspective, as it won't involve any words such as I, now, or here, which are based on self-identification. But as we have discussed earlier, some problems and arguments are based on specific perspectives. It requires the use of self-identification. Therefore, they cannot be reasoned from the impartial God's eye view, or view from nowhere, however you want to call it. Yet people feel like they should do it anyway, and the reasoning from this impartial perspective immediately runs into problems. Remember, self-identification is incommunicable and perspective-bound. This means it cannot be used from the impartial God's eye view. Which person does the word I refers to from a God's eye view anyway? It doesn't make any sense. So we are faced with the dilemma. While the argument or the problem focuses on the primitively identified self, yet that is not useful if we are conducting the reasoning with the impartial perspective. So to bridge this gap, we need to redefine the self into something useful, something explainable. And that's exactly what the anthropic assumptions does. It redefines the self as some sort of random sample from some sort of reference class, let it be actual or potentially existing observers. And these assumptions make reasoning from the God's eye view possible. But those additional assumptions, the ones redefines the self as some sort of random sample, they have problematic implications, and in fact they are not necessary at all. To avoid making paradoxes, all we need to do is just to reason from the particular perspective that the question or the argument is defined, without attempting to switch to the imaginary impartial perspective. And this also explains some of the oddities we mentioned earlier. For example, why is the doomsday argument, which is supposed to be just a simple Bayesian update, so tricky to explain? It's because there is a logical discontinuity in its reasoning. When the future is predicted, it is done from our particular perspective. But when we talk about the prior distribution of the birth rank, it is done with an impartial God's eye view, which justifies the principle of indifference and the uniform distribution. There is a perspective switch. So even though when we look at those two parts separately, there seems to be no logical mistake, but when the argument is put together, people naturally feel there is something not quite adding up. This also explains in the self-sampling assumption. Why is there a peculiar expression saying past, present, and future? It's because the arguments based on the self-sampling assumption cannot be entirely formulated from an impartial God's-eye view. Take the doomsday argument for example. Imagine if you really are the impartial observer, and then you took a random sample from all the humans, and it turns out that sample has a birth rank of 100 billion. Then you are totally right to say the total number of humans is more likely to be 200 billion instead of 200 trillion. There's no doubt that this logic is correct, and there's no need to say past, present, or future. The problem is, of course, we can't do this kind of sampling. And the doomsday argument used the self-identified I from a particular perspective and say this is the sample. Using this particular perspective introduces a unique present. And to pretend the argument is formulated from an impartial perspective, it has to mention to treat past, present, and future impartially, even though this impartiality has already been broken by considering the self as the sample, which put it in a logically unique position. So the takeaway for this video is that self-identification is based on the primitive perspective, and anthropic problems use self-identification in their formulation, so they should be reasoned from the given perspective. Trying to reason from an impartial perspective, from a God's-eye view, if you would, it will require additional assumptions. They lead to problematic implications and paradoxes. In the next video, I will give the numerical answer to the Sleeping Beauty problem. Meanwhile, think about this. Only look at the first of the three questions, about the probability of the coin toss. Which answer does not use any anthropic assumption? A half or a third? Or put it another way, which answer does not involve switching to the impartial observer's perspective to conduct the reasoning? I hope to see you in the next video.